Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Thompson, and I'm the Talent Operations Coordinator for British Canoeing. Welcome to today's Talent Parent Programme Nutrition for Vegetarian and Vegans webinar. This webinar builds on last year's Talent Parent webinars, and thanks to the feedback that we received, we've been working with performance nutritionist Terry Paulson from the English Institute of Sport to develop a webinar specifically tailored to address the nutritional needs of the vegan or vegetarian athlete. So thank you for those who are accessing this webinar today. Hopefully you'll be able to hear myself, and as we progress through this webinar, you should be able to see this presentation as well. There will also be an opportunity to ask any questions relating to this topic area at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Terry.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everybody. So yeah, it's become an extremely popular topic in recent months, especially since Game Changers came out. So yeah, all your questions that have come through already are really relevant. So we're going to look today at what is a vegetarian and vegan diet. Sorry, they're supposed to all come up at once. Should have checked the presentation on Dan's laptop. So what is a vegetarian and vegan diet? Do they improve performance? So are you solely choosing to follow this diet for performance reasons, or is it ethical, cultural, environmental? And then discussing if you do choose to become either vegetarian or vegan, identifying some of the challenges that do come with those diets. So looking at the potential pitfalls, but also if you do choose to do that, how could we actually overcome them? So there are varying different types of what you would call either a vegetarian or a vegan. If I just pop them all up actually. So they range from a lacto-ovo vegetarian who will avoid basically all meats, but will consume dairy and egg products. You've then got lacto-vegetarians who don't consume dairy but won't have eggs, all the way down to vegans who will basically not have anything that is animal-derived at all. So that even comes down to things like honey, because it's made by bees. You've then got a couple of extras that have become a lot more popular, the kind of wording in recent months and years. So either semi-vegetarian or flexitarian. So people who maybe are trying to reduce the impact on the environment and therefore taking a number of kind of meat-free days. We might call them flexitarians. They might have small amounts of meat, poultry, fish or seafood and dairy on just certain days of the week or just smaller amounts. And then also a pescatarian who also chooses to eat fish rather than animal meat. So the really big question, which I think anybody who's considering a vegetarian or vegan diet, if they're not already choosing to follow that, should ask themselves, do vegetarian or vegan diets improve performance? And just as we're going forward, I'm using that big V to indicate both of those diets. There is no strong evidence to suggest that a well-balanced vegetarian or vegan diet is likely to improve your performance beyond being an omnivore. So an omnivore is what we would probably call a normal diet, someone who eats most things and includes animal products. So there's no evidence that it can improve performance beyond eating that omnivore normal diet. However, on the flip side, a badly planned, somebody who's not very prepared on a weekly basis, who's a vegetarian or vegan, that may be detrimental to performance because you can underfuel or you may have deficiencies from both macro and micronutrients, so our energy providing nutrients and then all our vitamins and minerals. So definitely consider that when you're thinking, if you're thinking about it from a performance point of view. I would certainly say it doesn't improve performance. There may be other reasons you're choosing to follow this diet, and that's why I would suggest continuing to listen if you're in that group. So this is probably the only actual, what I would call a study, a reasonably controlled study that looks into whether it does improve performance. It's cross-sectional and it involves recreational runners that are already on these diets. They're already a vegan or a lacto-ovo vegetarian or an omnivore. So it's not that they've imposed this diet, it's that they've been doing it for years. They then looked at cycling exercise test to exhaustion, so gradually getting harder and harder, faster and faster until they couldn't go anymore. And they assessed the exercise parameters and their diet around it. So if we look a little bit at what they managed to eat in those diets, and again, none of this was controlled in the study, it's what they were doing naturally themselves. A few to highlight. Carbohydrate in the vegan diet is much higher. That's because most of the foods that are in a vegan diet are high in carbohydrate. Things like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and even your protein sources like your legumes, lentils, peas, things like that, they also contain reasonably high amounts of carbohydrate. And so it's very easy to eat a high carbohydrate diet being a vegan. And hence we may see improvements occasionally in endurance athletes. Now, we obviously aren't in a sport where it's necessarily about endurance, so we'll discuss that in a little bit. I'm sure you'll also be aware that one of the main caveats to a vegetarian diet to some extent, but definitely a vegan diet, is that you tend to have much lower protein intakes. So we can see here more around the 14 rather than the 16, 17 in the other two. They're two big things to look at from an energy and macronutrient point of view. One thing I haven't highlighted there, but you will see and we'll discuss actually, is that you tend to take in less fat because you're not eating all the saturated fats that come with animal products. And then also with the amount of carbohydrate that we eat, a lot of those foods, again, fruits, vegetables, whole grains and legumes, are really high in fibre. And so they also come often mean that's why we miss out on the protein as well, because we're not as hungry. So fibre is an extremely filling element. We then look at the vitamins and minerals, a few things to highlight. Now, if we look at the red box to start with, it's a vitamin called vitamin B12. This is low here, really low, and we'll go into some detail on it as to how you can improve that. Often you'll hear vegan diets being too low in iron, so you'll be very surprised to see that it's higher there. We'll also go into more detail about how actually the bioavailability of iron in vegan foods is lower. So you do need to eat more iron to actually get the right amount, the recommended amount for the day. And you'll also see that vitamin C, an antioxidant, is really high. And hopefully you're all aware that, if you're eating a lot of fruit and vegetables on any diet, you will be getting sufficient vitamin C. And so given that that makes up quite a large bulk of a vegan diet, it's really high there. And that certainly isn't a bad thing. It's great for immunity and also recovery. But to look at actually whether that improved performance, we can see here across all three of the diets with both the maximum power output across men and women, essentially there is no change. Even when we separate it by sex, there's no difference across those diets. So all of these different groups were doing similar amounts of training and there was no change despite the difference in diets. I then attempted to look for other studies. There's not really any other studies I could find other than case studies or questionnaire-based studies, and so there's nothing where people have got, a research group has said, we're going to do a controlled study where we place individuals, and certainly not athletes, on a vegan diet and assess the impact on performance. And so I can't give you any more information really as to whether it would improve performance. So then, if you do decide, or you're already a vegetarian or vegan, there are, as we mentioned, a few challenges, but we will also discuss the potential solutions and how you might get around that. So the challenges are really that a poorly structured vegetarian or vegan diet may predispose an athlete to deficiencies, and that may be those energy providing nutrients, total energy overall, protein, or omega-3s, so our healthy fats. And our micronutrients, so our vitamins and minerals, vitamin B12, vitamin D, iron, zinc, calcium, and iodine have also been shown to be lower and potentially verging on deficiency in vegan diets. Usually when little consideration, this only really occurs when little consideration is given to replacing the macro or micronutrients provided. And so, sorry, I'm just going to flip back if we can. By excluding certain food groups, as you would do in one of these diets, so potentially removing dairy would mean that we are putting at risk our calcium intake. And by removing things like meat and eggs, we're putting at risk our iron intake. There are a few potential positives, which we've already discussed a little bit. A plant-based diet is likely to increase your intake of fruits and vegetables. These contain antioxidants and other micronutrients, which are great for recovery and immunity, and also a lot of carbohydrate-rich foods. So to get energy in, potentially for endurance sports, then you could see benefits, positives. So they can aid both training and recovery. But you can do this being an omnivore, so that normal diet we were talking about as well. So just by increasing some of your plant-based foods in your diet, but still putting in some of those important other foods that will give you some of these micronutrients we're discussing, then you can get all of that training and recovery benefits as well. It's not necessarily an and/or. It can be both. So always increasing your fruit and veg intake for anybody is usually a good recommendation. So can it work for a canoe sprint athlete? Well, yes, but only if you plan your diet to meet all of your basic needs and your needs that are your energy needs around training. And if we then put that onto a younger athlete, we need to ensure that they're also meeting the needs of their development. And we'll discuss some of that. So things like your calcium and your iron for younger athletes. One of the caveats to that is canoe sprint is a power-based sport, and therefore protein for muscle growth and repair is really important. And as we've already highlighted, and we'll go into a little bit more detail in a minute, is that sometimes it's harder to get in a vegan diet, especially. So ensuring sufficient intakes of protein is harder and therefore may compromise an athlete's ability to build strength and power. Now, data indicates that vegans eat fewer calories and also have a lower body mass index. So that's just a way of looking at somebody's body composition than vegetarians and omnivores. And again, a lot of that comes from the fact that you're eating very high fibrous foods that fill you up, and therefore sometimes we don't get enough energy in. Again, plant-based diets do contain a lot of carbohydrates, so it can be good either for endurance sport or within this sport in a high volume phase of training. And you certainly can consume sufficient energy, but sometimes people don't, and this causes unwanted weight loss. And if, again, in a power sport, sometimes that is going to impact performance. And as we mentioned, both vegetarian but specifically vegan diets do contain a lot more fibre, and this can reduce appetite, leading again to that unwanted weight loss or under-fueling of training. So when energy demands are high in training, and again, if we're adding on development and growth within some of these younger athletes, we sometimes need to really consider that vegan diet and ensure we're not taking in excess amounts of fibre at the expense of energy to fuel training. So we've already mentioned it a few times. Athletes, especially power athletes, which I work with here at Canoe, do need more protein than the general population. And we'd be looking more around kind of 1.5 to 1.7 grams per kilogram body mass rather than sedentary being kind of 0.8 to 1 gram. That's per day. Vegans do, we know, can consume less protein overall than non-vegans. And also we know that plant-based protein sources are often incomplete. So amino acids are our building blocks of protein, basically. Some are essential, some are non-essential, but we have to get those essential ones from our diet. And some of those are missing. Whereas if you ate either a chicken breast or a steak or any kind of animal protein, you are going to get all of those amino acids in one. So what you then have to do is think about ensuring you eat a really wide range of plant-based proteins to ensure that you do meet those needs and you get all of your amino acids so that the athlete can build strength and power and muscle. Excuse me. So yes, they're often incomplete, but they're also less well absorbed. So again, I put a question down here around, a lot of people always say, do I need a protein supplement if I'm on a vegan diet? Well, no, and certainly at this age group, I wouldn't recommend a protein supplement. We'd like to always think about food first, but that just requires a lot of planning. But again, if we compare a protein supplement, we compare a whey protein supplement to either soy or pea protein, there are numerous studies out there that show that the uptake of that protein and how quickly it will be absorbed to aid recovery is slower with the plant-based protein powders. So certainly, anybody under 18 or in that kind of development stage, I would certainly recommend getting everything you can from food. And you can see here one of the key amino acids that you really require for building muscle and strength and power is leucine, so that one in the middle. And you can get that from various sources, including soybeans, so tofu as well, oats, legumes, peanuts, and lentils. But again, we've discussed trying to combine lots of the different sources of protein so that you're getting a wide range and you can meet your needs across the day. It doesn't need to be at every single meal, but across the day you need to eat that wide range. Fats is another one, and we've already mentioned that especially vegans tend to eat less fat, and certainly saturated fat, because we get a lot of that from animal products. Recommended intakes for an average diet, maybe around 30% of the diet coming from fats. Often in athletes, we do tend to see this being lower, and again, in vegan diets, we will tend to see it lower. In vegan diets, we typically see higher amounts of omega-6, and you can see some of the examples there, like soybeans, nuts and seeds, where we would find those. So our focus, ideally, we're looking for a better proportion, so not too many omega-6 and more omega-3. So a focus certainly in a plant-based diet are more around those omega-3 sources. So fortified foods and flax seeds, walnuts, things like that. Now, we mentioned iron. This is certainly a big one and often is a focus. Our main source of iron and our most available source of iron is called heme iron, and that always comes from an animal source. Whereas if we're following a plant-based diet, it would all be non-heme. It would be a non-heme plant iron source. So a vegan diet often, again, we've seen from that initial data in the study that you can eat similar, if not higher amounts of iron following these diets. But unfortunately, the way in which our body accesses that iron is not quite as good. So the bioavailability of those sources is not as high. And so, sorry, you can see at the bottom, if I just flip, the Institute of Medicine, and this still goes, I know it looks old, but indicates that you require 1.8 times more iron in a vegan diet than you would on an omnivore diet to be able to get the recommended amount. And you'll see in the table below how much you need. So our young athletes, anyone 13 to 18 years, we're looking either between 11 and 15, depending on your gender, milligrams per day. And once we get beyond that 18, slightly less for males and more for females. And that's because of menstruation within females. So we're obviously losing blood during menstruation, and so we're also losing iron within that. So it's extremely important for female athletes and developing female athletes. If we do have low iron, and that's the iron store in the body is called ferritin. So if we have low ferritin, there's the potential for us to get something called anemia. And so we have fewer red blood cells that carry the oxygen around our body. And hence the impact is that we become tired, we feel weaker, we feel fatigued, and we certainly can't tolerate exercise as much. So we're not able to push ourselves as hard or go for as long. On a lot of these slides, you will see that I've put an asterisk that says assess blood levels prior to supplementation, we had a couple of questions around, do I need to take certain micronutrients or supplement with certain supplements? And certainly, potentially in females, if you're on a vegan diet, it probably is something you need to do. But I would always recommend that you get your blood levels tested before using anything high dose. There's a few things, unfortunately, that make it even harder for you to get the amount of iron that you require. So phytates, again, in something extremely high in a plant-based diet, whole grains and legumes. Polyphenols, which you'll find in tea, coffee, cocoa, and dairy. So obviously if you're a vegetarian, in non-milk and eggs, they act as inhibitors. So if we're taking these ingredients in at the same time as something that contains iron, then unfortunately we won't absorb as much of that iron as we would if we weren't consuming those ingredients. On the flip side, you can increase the absorption by consuming vitamin C rich foods at the same time. So essentially any fruits and vegetables, as long as you've not boiled them to death and lost all of that water-soluble vitamin C into your boiling water. So recommended to steam or stir fry or roast to keep some of those vitamins. That will help you to absorb the iron. So making sure that you're having them at the same time. Vegan sources of iron include things like green and cruciferous vegetables, tofu, all your legumes, sprouted things, soy, and also fortified foods. Now, again, with your developing athletes, it's extremely important for bone health that we ensure that we're getting sufficient calcium. Now, calcium, is extremely important for bone health, alongside vitamin D that we'll have a quick discussion about in a minute. And you'll see, its highest amount is basically in dairy products. And so by removing those, if you're following a vegan diet, it does make it harder, unless I'll show you in a second if you do always use fortified foods, which again can be a little bit more expensive and slightly harder to find. Supplementation can sometimes be required, especially in these younger athletes if they really do not feel they're getting enough in their diet. But I'd certainly say talk to either your GP or a registered dietitian nutritionist before doing that. You'll see the recommended dietary allowance there again, split into males and females and across age groups. And to put that into context, I apologise, this is quite small, so maybe I'll kind of come back, but it shows you how much is in kind of a portion of certain foods. And you'll see that mostly it's dairy sources at the top and then non-dairy sources at the bottom. And again, to just put that into further context, I've split that down into how you might get what you need for around 1,000 milligrams per day, whether you're following a vegetarian or omnivore diet or a vegan diet. And I think the big thing to focus on here, because actually you'd probably look at that if you were a vegan and go, well, I'd do that in a day easily. But the big thing, certainly if you were considering becoming a vegan, is that importance of those fortified foods. Because if you were just using an unfortified soy, milk or yogurt or cereal, then you would have to eat absolutely kilos of broccoli and tofu to get the amount that you would require. Whereas quite easily, if you eat dairy, we can have less than a pint of milk, which could be spread across cereals or in recovery. A really small matchbox size of cheese, and as your little bit of treat is a little bit of milk chocolate in there. So smaller amounts potentially on the left, but also just ensuring that you use those fortified foods if you're on a vegan diet. So we mentioned calcium always comes hand in hand with vitamin D. So it helps the absorption of calcium and also something called phosphorus from your gut, which is then going to help with bone health. And in these young athletes, certainly through adolescence, bone health is extremely important. That's when you're building all of the bone mineral density in your bones for later life. So ensuring that we give the right micronutrients for that to happen is really important. It also influences other bodily processes. So vitamin D, I'm sure that it's been in the press an awful lot around winter, aids with immune function, mood and memory, and also a really important one for athletes is your muscle recovery. So we want to ensure that we're getting sufficient amounts. Unfortunately, we get very little from our food. So when I say food first, occasionally it just doesn't really work. We can make it from the sun, and that's the main way that we would get enough in our body. But unless you're listening to this from abroad, unfortunately, we live in the UK and have very little sunshine throughout the autumn and winter, and certainly not enough sunshine that is strong enough to create enough vitamin D. So the recommendation is that a lot of people will make enough vitamin D if they spend 15 minutes in the midday sun when it's strong enough. But you can't use sun cream, and you need to expose most of your skin. So I'm not imagining many of us go and sit out in our bikini for 15 minutes while we eat our lunch, even in the summer, never mind in the autumn and winter, and it probably isn't strong enough anyway. So we can find it in a few foods, but you'll see there that none of those really are vegan friendly. And hence, being a vegan does put you at risk of a deficiency here. Also, unfortunately, even if we do look to supplementation, a lot of vitamin D supplements are not vegan friendly. So you do need to, if you're a strict vegan, look out for a vitamin D2 or a lichen-derived D3 supplement. And you'll see that the recommended dietary allowance there is 600 international units or 15 micrograms. And actually, the evidence across the board now throughout autumn and winter is that we should all in the UK be supplementing. So we'd be looking at 10 micrograms per day. And that will aid with your immunity, but also help the athletes from a kind of muscle recovery and bone point of view. Another one is vitamin B12. So vitamin B12 does many bodily processes, importantly for us, protein metabolism, but also the formation of those red blood cells we spoke about earlier that's going to take the oxygen to all the working muscles when we're training. Also plays a crucial role in the nervous system, so kind of the firing of the nervous system as we're exercising. Again, you'll see that a lot of vitamin B12 is found in meat, fish, poultry, eggs, milk and milk products. So again, not overly vegan friendly. So again, we are at risk of deficiency. There are a few sources that you can include where we can meet our needs. Again, if we look at the bottom, to meet our either 1.8 micrograms for 9 to 13-year-olds or anybody over the age of 14. Apologies, I've missed a G off there, 2.4 micrograms daily. And actually, one serve of nutritional yeast, if you choose to use it, will pretty much do that for you. And also you can get decent amounts from other yeast extracts, so such as Marmite. And nowadays we've also got some breakfast cereals and milks that are being fortified, given that the kind of vegan following is much higher nowadays. A lot of companies kind of got on board with that and have decided to start fortifying foods. So again, just like the calcium, you need to start being a little bit more savvy when you're shopping and making sure that you're opting for those fortified ingredients so that you are hitting your recommended dietary allowances. This is another one that certainly I'm going to ask Dan to put a BDA fact sheet, so a British Dietetic Association fact sheet up with a lot of this information around plant-based diets. One thing that you often won't get on a standard one, but is quite relevant for athletes, is creatine and carnosine or beta-alanine. So I'm sure a lot of you will have heard of creatine as a supplement, but it's certainly something that even without supplementation, we do get a decent amount of it in our diets if we are an omnivore, because it purely comes from animal products, so meat. Poultry and fish and seafood is more the carnosine and beta-alanine. Creatine helps us to regenerate ATP, so our energy, a lot quicker, and so it allows us, especially in the gym, to do more work with less recovery, and so it helps us to build strength and power in the long run. We've also got something called carnosine, which sits in the muscles, and that helps us to buffer hydrogen ions. So you know everybody talks about that burn. That's the change in pH, the acidity within the muscles. And by having sufficient or high saturated amounts of carnosine in the muscle, we can help to buffer those hydrogen ions and help us to do more or do the same amount but not have quite as much of that burn. So it'll eat both of these things are important for power athletes, as they'll help to increase strength and aid with intermittent interval type training. Now, vegans have approximately 50% less carnosine in their muscles versus meat eaters. And so you can see where we might start to see other reasons why vegans may not be able to build quite as much power. I certainly wouldn't be recommending supplementation here, but it is just for awareness for a developing athlete. But we do use supplementation at an elite level. But again, I'd certainly recommend talking to a registered dietitian or nutritionist on that topic. I do feel a bit like I've rattled through this, apologies, but this is just a final little mention, because as you'll see at the bottom, I've put a severe warning straight away: do not follow a raw food diet. It has become a little bit of a following recently that people are following this raw food diet, so essentially not doing any cooking processes. And a lot of plants, certainly raw plants, contain things called anti-nutrients. These are plant compounds that reduce the body's ability to absorb essential nutrients, which we've just gone through so many things that actually you could already be deficient in. And if we're then adding other things in that are not allowing us to even absorb the amounts that we are eating, there are obviously issues there. So there's a few here. Things like glucosinolates found in things like cruciferous vegetables, which are very high in a plant-based diet. In the brackets each time, I've written how we can increase the ability to absorb nutrients when we're eating these things. So basically, cook those cruciferous vegetables. Phytates, often found in legumes, we either need to allow them to sprout, soak, or ferment. Tannins found in tea, again, soak, or boil. Lectins found in grains, soak, boil, heat, or ferment them. And protease inhibitors, that's a protein enzyme, often found in seeds, basically soak, sprout, or boil. And similarly for your leafy greens, soak or boil them. And that will ensure that again, you can do a mixture of these things. You can have them raw and you can cook them, but it's sometimes worth looking into how you're combining ingredients. And it just takes me back to what I said at the start. You can follow a plant-based diet and be an athlete and be successful, but you really have to be really prepared and organized and actually have a really good understanding of where your micro and macronutrients are coming from, so that you're meeting both your health and your performance needs. And so just a few top tips, really. I'd certainly say if you are already following one of these diets, have a little look, maybe go back through the presentation or look through the BDA fact sheet I'm going to ask Dan to pop on, to try and assess what you are currently doing and just see, actually, you might sit there and go, I'm doing all of that, it's fine. But you may sit down and go, oh gosh, I've got none of those types of food that are giving me that leucine that means that I'm going to be able to build muscle. Or I'm not using any fortified foods and therefore I'm not getting enough calcium. So I'd say try and have a little bit of a look at what's currently going on in your diet if you're following one of these plant-based diets. Ensure meals are balanced, and that often means, especially for a vegan diet, ensuring that you do get sufficient protein in there, because it's the easiest one to drop off. It's very easy to eat fruits and vegetables and whole grains, but forget to find some kind of protein source. Things like, if you do like things like tofu, or there are now some corn ranges that are vegan, or your legumes, lentils, peas, things like that. Ensure energy intake is sufficient for the amount of training that you're doing, and so that we don't get unwanted weight gain. And very occasionally on the flip side, unwanted weight loss. On the flip side, sometimes unwanted weight gain if we do end up just eating a crazy amount of carbohydrates where we're not actually doing sufficient volume to burn them off. We've mentioned that protein from a variety of sources, so that we get all of those different amino acids, so that we can build healthy and strong muscles. Include some of those healthy fats and really try and focus on omega-3 sources. And I think I've already just mentioned, really have a look when you're doing your shop to ensure that you are using some of those fortified foods, because otherwise it can be quite easy to miss out on some of those really important micronutrients, especially calcium and iron for our developing and then our female athletes. But as if we take you back to the start, don't just choose to go on one of these diets because you think it will improve canoeing performance. If it's for any other reason, whether it is to help with the environment or it's just ethical, then that is fine. But I'd certainly say do all of these things, look at your diet, and seek support if you don't think that you're meeting your needs. But certainly don't do it thinking that it's going to be a quick magic way to get on that Olympic podium in the next 5 to 10 years. So yeah, hopefully that's covered quite a lot of information, and yeah, I'll hand it over to see if we've got any questions, Dan.
So thank you, Terry. Thank you for delivering that really interesting webinar today on what's a really popular topic area, and talking about those key micro and macronutrients that we have within our diet, and obviously the likely deficiencies that we can potentially have in a vegetarian or vegan diet in particular there. So we did have a couple of questions that come through prior to the webinar, and now open it up to anybody if they want to drop a question in the chat feature below, and Terry will do her best to answer that question for you. So one of the questions that come through prior to the webinar was, do I need to take anything extra if I drink fortified soya or oat milks?
Yeah, it's quite a broad question in the sense of, if you're drinking a fortified soy or oat milk, you hopefully are getting the fortified calcium. Check that it's also fortified with potentially vitamin D and that B12 that we've spoken about. However, one thing I would recommend, especially for the athletes, is that with something like an oat milk, and again, it's very similar for any of the nut milks, it's like an almond milk or even a coconut milk, it's much lower in protein than a soy milk. So if you're looking to use an alternative milk for your protein source, as well as getting those fortified vitamins and minerals, I would certainly recommend going down the soy route rather than oat, almond, rice, all of those, because the protein is a lot lower. So again, if you're using something like a milk, we would recommend often in recovery, then the only way to do that and actually meet your protein needs is to use a soy. But if that question is that you're already using a fortified milk, then obviously you've already got a big tick from the top tips if you're following a plant-based diet.
It's great. I've got one other question. So you referred to in one of the examples about a canoe sprint athlete, probably because your experience of working with in the canoe sprint discipline. But just for clarity, is that the same for a canoe slalom athlete as well?
Yeah, apologies. Yes, yeah. I mean, there's still all of the pitfalls, so they would be no different. I would say slalom would definitely still require a lot of power and strength, and agility, and so I would, yeah, it all still applies across the sport.
Great. We did have a couple of other questions, but we should actually hopefully have been answered within your presentation, Terry. But As always, we'll upload the resources that Terry mentioned about on the Talent Parent Programme webpage, along with this webinar afterwards. So that should be uploaded within the next couple of weeks. So thank you, Terry, for delivering that presentation for us today.